This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web.
Hey there, Rose here. Today's Best in Climate was originally published in The Guardian on December 5th, 2021, and is part of Covering Climate Now, a global journalism collaboration strengthening coverage of the climate story. This article actually made my heart lighter just reading it. I hope it will have the same effect on you. It details startups transforming captured carbon into useful products. And it's entitled Pollutant to Product, the companies making stuff from CO2. It was written by Zoe Corbin. Zoe's a freelance journalist who specializes in science technology, research, higher education, and ideas. She is based in San Francisco. In a warehouse laboratory in Berkeley, California, Nicholas Flanders stands in front of a shiny metal box about the size of a washing machine. Inside is a stack of metal plates that resemble a club sandwich. Only the filling is a black polymer membrane coated with proprietary metal catalyst. We call the membrane the black leaf, he says. Flanders is the co-founder and CEO of 12, a startup founded in 2015, which received a $57 million funding boost in July. It aims to take air, or to be more precise, the carbon dioxide, CO2 in it, and transform it into something useful, as plants do, eliminating damaging emissions in the process. Taking the unwanted gas wreaking havoc on our climate and using only water and renewable energy, 12's metal box houses a new kind of electrolyzer that transforms the CO2 into synthetic gas, syngas, a mix of carbon monoxide and hydrogen that can be made into a range of familiar products, usually made from fossil fuels. Oxygen is the only byproduct. This August, the pilot scale equipment made the syngas that went into what Flanders claims is the world's first carbon-neutral, fossil-free jet fuel produced by electrolyzing CO2. Quote, "This is a new way of moving carbon through our economy without pulling it out of the ground," he says. 12 is one of the many companies beginning to make stuff out of CO2, captured either from industrial emissions or directly from the air. High-end goods such as vodka, diamonds, and activewear, industrial materials such as concrete, plastic, foam, and carbon fiber, and even food are all beginning to be created using CO2. In addition to jet fuel, which is a partnership with the U.S. Air Force, 12 has been using its syngas to explore making parts of car interiors with Mercedes-Benz, laundry detergent ingredients with Tide, and sunglass lenses with Pangaea. Online marketplaces such as Expedition Air and Sky Baron are even springing up to sell consumer goods made with CO2 emissions. We are at the very early end of a new carbon tech industry, says Pat Seppensley of the Urban Future Lab at New York University, who oversees a new accelerator program to help fledgling startups get a foothold. While the industry is still only emerging, most activity is only at bench or pilot scale. It is estimated by the lab that there are now about 350 startups hoping to deliver so-called carbon to value. Venture capital investment has sharply risen. This year, over $550 million had flowed in by the end of September, according to research and consulting firm Cleantech Group. That's more than in the 5 previous years put together. The sector could have the potential to reduce the world's CO2 emissions by more than 10%, according to analysis by the University of Michigan's Global CO2 Initiative, which aims to help the sector emerge. Fuels and building materials such as concrete and aggregate are considered to hold the biggest CO2 mitigation and market potential. That contribution, advocates argue, firmly makes carbon utilization part of the suite of technologies we are going to need to reach the net zero commitments governments and corporations have been making, and which it is becoming clear can't be met by renewable electricity alone. Quote, I don't see a path to net zero without these kind of technologies, says Richard Youngman, CEO of Clean Tech Group. Premium running shoe brand On, which went public this September, realized that if it was going to reach its aggressive net zero targets, it would need to rethink its materials. Its vision is now that half of all its shoe bottom foam will be made not from petrochemicals, but captured carbon. Last month, it announced plans to team up with US-based startup LanzaTech, an early pioneer of the sector, which uses a patented fermentation process to make ethanol out of waste carbon monoxide collected from factories, which would otherwise be burnt to emit CO2, and chemical manufacturer Borealis, which makes the foam by polymerizing ethylene, to which ethanol can be converted. On is hopeful to unveil its first pair of shoes made wholly from captured carbon sometime next year. It has separate arrangements to make the shoe uppers. That first pair will cost about $1 million to make, says Casper Capetti, On's co-founder and executive co-chairman. It's a lab endeavor to prove viability, but eventually, when it scales, he doesn't expect the shoes to cost much more than a regular pair. It's not that CO2 isn't already used industrially. Think carbonated beverages. But those uses either put the gas unchanged back into the atmosphere, or in the case of enhanced oil recovery, where injected CO2 pushes out oil and then remains underground, still perpetuates the extraction of new fossil fuels. What's different here is that waste CO2 is chemically transformed to make new products. Some, such as building materials, eliminate emissions by locking the carbon away permanently. Others, such as jet fuel, prevent new emissions by recycling already emitted carbon. Often grouped with utilization is CO2 sequestration, which promises to store large amounts of captured CO2 permanently underground. But the two are quite different, as advocates point out. Quote, it's almost a sin to throw away a valuable resource, says Volker Sick, a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan, who directs the Global CO2 Initiative. The beauty of carbon is that you can make so many different things. New York-based startup Air Company, launched in 2017, is selling CO2-made vodka and perfume and produced hand sanitizer during the pandemic. Like 12, it starts with CO2, water, and renewable energy, but combines them in its reactor to make alcohols such as ethanol. A liter of vodka removes a pound of CO2, and it may soon even use CO2 captured from the heating systems of Manhattan office buildings in a collaboration with capture startup Carbon Quest. But like 12, Air Company has jet fuel in its sights, which can be produced from ethanol. It's a crowded field. Others pressing ahead with CO2-made jet fuel include LanzaJet, a spin-off from ethanol maker LanzaTech, and Synhelion, which uses solar energy to transform CO2 to syngas. Typically, it is small amounts, think liters per hour, of jet fuel being made at this stage, says Ian Hayton, a materials and chemicals analyst at Cleantech Group. But countries are beginning to introduce quotas for sustainable aviation fuels, which could move things forwards. And the advantage of making it from CO2 rather than biomass or waste vegetable oils is that it uses far less land. Canadian company Carbon Cure, founded in 2012, is one of the pioneers on the building materials side. Backed by investors such as Breakthrough Energy Ventures, Bill Gates' investment firm, its technology involves injecting CO2 into concrete as it is being mixed. The injected CO2 reacts with the wet concrete and rapidly becomes permanently stored as a mineral, the same one as in limestone. Carbon Cure's business model is to license its technology to concrete manufacturers themselves. CarbonCure retrofits their systems, transforming them into carbon tech companies. The CO2 is supplied by waste emission sources in their region. It gives them a green sales advantage, but really what the concrete producers like is the economic benefit, says co-founder and CEO Robert Niven. It means less cement is needed to make the concrete. Most are able to reduce their cement content by about 5%, and the addition of the CO2 also strengthens the final material. It's hard to imagine that food in the form of protein could be mass produced from CO2, but that is exactly what another subset of carbon tech companies are working on. Some, such as Solar Foods in Finland and Air Protein in California, which uses the tagline, meat made from air, intend their products for human consumption, while others, such as UK and Netherlands-based Deep Branch, are focusing on animal feed ingredients. With inputs typical of CO2, water, and renewable electricity, along with ammonia and nutrients, their proteins are produced in bioreactors from naturally occurring microbes. The microbes grow and multiply and are then dried out to produce a protein powder with all the essential amino acids. It's somewhere between dried meat, dried soy, and dried carrot, says Pasi Vanika. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Solar Foods co-founder and CEO of its product, Solein. Admittedly, that doesn't sound very appetizing, but, says Vanika, the taste comes in the final product, and Solein is versatile. It could replace pea and soy protein isolate in processed foods, or even be used as feed for the cultivated meat industry. Treated with heat and pressure, it can be eaten like a tasty slab of steak or tofu. 2 kilograms of CO2 make a kilogram of the product, and it has been submitted to food regulators in Europe and the UK for novel food approval. Yet the field also faces many challenges to come to fruition. First, if the technology is really going to serve the climate, it has to be scaled up for mass production quickly and offer price competitive products. Quote, "There's no point unless we can deliver on scale," said Alison Dring, CEO of German startup Made of Air, which is focusing on plastic replacements. Many of the companies have plans for their first commercial facilities. 12, for example, has designed its equipment to be modular, so it can easily be added to increase capacity, a bit like a solar farm. Hopes to have its first shipping container-sized plant by next year and predicts significant commercial volume by 2023. But scaling up is capital intensive and takes time. One specific roadblock is finding customers. The startups need bigger companies to pair up with to buy their CO2 made raw materials, but it can be hard for them to break into established supply chains. A big focus of the Startup Accelerator program run out of the Urban Futures Lab called C2V Initiative is on making inter-industry connections, but really more early movers like ON are needed. CarbonCure is proud of the fact that 450 concrete plants have been retrofitted with its technology, accounting for virtually all the carbon utilization project deployments to date, says Niven, but it is only a tiny fraction of more than the 100,000 concrete plants there are worldwide. Right now, what we need is partners, he says. Another bottleneck to scale may be providing the large and low-cost quantities of CO2 needed. While technologies are certainly established to capture CO2 from industrial sources, it is only done at a minuscule scale at present, experts note. Direct air capture is less technologically developed and more expensive, and infrastructure will be needed to move the CO2 if, for example, it is being captured in a different place from where it is being used. Massive government intervention and support are required for rapid growth, say advocates. Be that by setting a carbon price, through procurement policies and government contracts that require CO2-based alternatives, or by infrastructure investment. Quote, "This needs to be exponential growth, and we need policies to support it," says Peter Styring, an expert in carbon capture and utilization at the University of Sheffield, who directs its Center for Carbon Dioxide Utilization. And while U.S. efforts are welcome, the U.S. infrastructure bill, for example, includes over $8 billion for direct air capture and CO2 transportation and storage. Quote, there is space for governments to be braver, says Cleantech's Youngman. More detailed guidelines for carbon accounting might also be needed to aid consumer acceptance. Life cycle analysis for the products need to take the whole of the supply chain into account. But companies can set the boundaries in a way that excludes some processes. Quote, we studied concrete production, and in some cases, it actually was worse than just making regular concrete, says Sick. Both he and Styring are working on improving how companies might perform their assessments as part of an international effort. And just how controversial carbon utilization will be remains an open question. Not everyone is gung-ho. Innovation has a role to play in curbing climate change, says Mike Childs, head of policy at the environmental campaign group Friends of the Earth. But such wonder technologies are unproven to work on the massive scale envisioned, and therefore a huge gamble with both people's lives and the planet. Quote, we know that driving down emissions at source is the best and cheapest way to limit global heating, he says, adding that the technology also risks providing political and business leaders with justification to keep burning fossil fuels. The transition away from fossil fuels is a must, say the advocates of CO2 utilization. But if we want a modern life to go on as normal without sacrifices, we'll need to find new ways of continuing to produce the goods fossil fuels have given us. This industry, they argue, will not only help mitigate climate change, but provide the carbon-based products we will always need. Quote, there's a lot of climate don'ts, says Flanders, but you can actually continue to use products you like, just made in a better way. So there you have it, some food for thought. Instead of doing away with carbon-based products, a way to recycle the carbon that's already out there. And Lord knows there's a lot of it. It always lifts me to see solutions. And I do believe that humans are incredibly creative. We work best when our backs are against the wall, and our backs are against the wall right now. Let's keep focusing on the positive. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.
That's this week's episode of Best in Climate for Earth Feels.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.